Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Congressman Correa, for inviting U.S. Immigration Law Group to be a part of these education forums that you are so committed to doing for our community. It is our commitment as well to make sure that our community is educated, equipped, and empowered with the best and latest immigration information so that they can make an informed decision for themselves and for their families. So today, it is my pleasure to be here with you. We're going to be talking about some recent immigration policy changes, some breaking news that you've probably heard of, and as well as some pending legislation, and kind of steps that you can be doing right now to prepare yourself for potential changes in our immigration law. So kind of some major pieces of news. One is that on March 9th, the Biden administration decided to drop its defense of the public charge rule. So many of you may be aware that there were some major changes in the interpretation of the rule. The rule has been around for decades. However, the Trump administration decided to create its own interpretation of the public charge and would look at various factors like age, employment, language fluency, formal education, et cetera, and kind of issue negative points or positive points depending on where immigrants fell when they're applying for their permanent residency status. I am very happy to tell you that that is no longer the rule. We are now back to the 1999 interpretation, which essentially means that the immigrant still needs to demonstrate that they will not become a public charge, meaning that they're not going to be dependent on government assistance, things like food stamps or welfare, and that they're able to support themselves, or that the petitioner is able to demonstrate that they can support themselves. But they're not going to kind of get really picky about what exactly the factors are in terms of how the government's going to come into to that conclusion. So it's a huge relief, especially for our elderly immigrants, U.S. citizens petitioning for their parents, for example, that often may not speak English, may not be educated. They're clearly over 61. And so now there's a significant relief, right? Both for our elderly applicants, but also just to relieve a lot of pressure, because there are legitimate benefits related to health, nutrition, and housing that immigrants qualify for that don't impact public charge. But I think there was so much fear and anxiety for such a long period of time that people were avoiding any and all types of public benefits, even for their U.S. citizen children. So the good news is that interpretation of public charge is over. We're kind of back to where we were before the Trump administration. And let's just say it is good news for anyone who is applying for permanent residency in the United States. Another major announcement was, for the first time in decades, the Department of Homeland Security has designated another country for temporary protected status. Venezuelans are now eligible. Those individuals with temporary protected status receive protection from deportation, work authorization, and they can obtain travel authorization. Any Venezuelan that wants to apply for TPS, the deadline is September 5th of 2021. So they do still have about 6 months and to get their application submitted. It will be valid for a period of 18 months. And can be extended beyond that period of time as well. And then we'll have to wait and see whether or not the government decides to continue to extend TPS for Venezuelans. They need to demonstrate that they've been physically present in the United States since March 8th. So this does not mean for recent or new arrivals after March 8th. And in terms of the cost, the application is the I-821. Don't get that confused with the I-821D, which is for DACA, deferred action. It's I-821 plus the I-765 for the work authorization. The government fees with the work permit is $535, and without the work permit is $135. And that, of course, is on top of any costs or fees for organizations or attorneys you may go to seeking assistance with preparing these filings. In addition, ICE has issued a memorandum out in February. We're going to see some additional guidance come out probably in the next 90 days. The Biden administration had initially indicated that it would halt removals or deportations for a period of 100 days. This memorandum essentially eliminates that pause. Excuse me. And so it actually makes very clear for the time being what ICE's priorities are. And again, ICE is Immigration Customs Enforcement. It's essentially the enforcement or police for immigration, those that are here in the United States without lawful status or have been immigration violators. They've committed crimes or they've violated our immigration laws. So in terms of the priorities for the government right now, it's basically people who ICE considers national security threats, right? So, that's not a whole lot of people, but if anyone has been engaged with terrorist activities or belonging to political or terrorist organizations, they could potentially be considered, a national security threat. Recent arrivals, so people who've entered since November 1st, 2020. So people have entered in the last, 4 or 5 months. They're going to be a priority. The government's trying to avoid, people establishing deeper roots. So they're going to kind of focus like last in, first out, and focus on, apprehending or removing those individuals. Also, people that ICE has labeled a public safety threat. So again, I've said this again and again, but anyone with criminal convictions that's not a U.S. citizen absolutely must have their criminal history evaluated by a competent immigration attorney to understand what the immigration consequences are of their criminal convictions. So anyone with an aggravated felony, so that is a specific definition for immigration laws. So people are surprised sometimes when they've been convicted of a misdemeanor, but it's really an aggravated felony under our immigration laws. And the reason for that is that immigration laws are federal. And so if Texas considers something a misdemeanor, but it's a felony somewhere else, we have to evaluate the actual code, the penal code that the person was convicted for, and determine what are the immigration implications of that conviction. Anyone who has a gang-related conviction will also be a priority for ICE to be removed, and anyone who is over 16 and who has intentionally participated in a gang. Those that would not would require approval from supervisors, so it's not that ICE agents can't simply arrest and detain these individuals, are the elderly. If an individual has physical or mental illness, if the individual has a pending appeal in federal court, or if an individual has a pending motion to reopen. So those individuals would require basically a second level of evaluation before the government will make a decision to remove them or not. So those are kind of some of the priorities. Again, in the memorandum, we're going to see some additional guidance probably in the next 60 days. In terms of pending legislation, I'm going to touch on 3. We're going to go into a little bit of depth because I think it's really important for people to know kind of what's potentially on the horizon. I'll let Congressman Correa speak specific to the ins and outs of perhaps the debates and kind of discussions that are happening on the Hill in DC. But we're going to talk about the DREAM Act of 2021. I believe this is the 5th time we've seen a DREAM Act of one kind or another be introduced. This is very similar to the last DREAM Act that was introduced, and it's basically, again, for the people that we may perhaps call dreamers, the DACA recipients, those people who were brought to the United States as children and have lived here most of their lives. The beauty between and the major difference between the DREAM Act and what we know as DACA is that, DACA is not legal status. So the DREAM Act actually allows those individuals who qualify to have a pathway to first conditional residency, then permanent residency, and obviously access to U.S. citizenship, which DACA does not give. So it's really important, right, that we're aware of these pieces of legislation, that we are in communication with our congressional representatives, both in the House and the Senate, and really urging and encouraging them to support these bills. The second one we're going to talk about is H.R. 6. It's the Dream and Promise Act. It was a bill known by a very similar name last congressional session, which was the American Dream and Promise Act, which did pass the House in June of 2019. It also recently passed the House in 2021, and so now it's going to go to the Senate. This is essentially the DREAM Act, but it's even a little bit broader, and I'll talk a little bit more in depth in terms of what those broader provisions entail. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. There's 2 pieces of legislation. One was introduced in the House, the other one was introduced in the Senate, and it's probably the biggest and broadest bill that we have currently pending that you would equate to an amnesty, right? It's going to be much broader than individuals who were brought here to the United States as children. It's going to open so many opportunities for those with TPS, those in higher education. We're going to go through some of the, what I would consider the highlights or the major points of that bill. So first, let's talk about the DREAM Act. So the DREAM Act is going to protect dreamers, similar to DACA, right? But it's going to be a broader population. So just because you don't have DACA right now doesn't mean you're not going to qualify from the DREAM Act. Okay, so it's going to basically allow what I believe this number's old. It says 700,000, but I believe there's over a million now DACA recipients, especially since the government began accepting new initial applications again in December. And then there's also kind of 1.4 million eligible dreamers. And they're called dreamers because they're people that may not qualify for DACA for one reason or another. They don't satisfy one of the requirements, but for the most part, they're essentially in the same situation, same position. So these are, obviously young people who have been educated, who as taxpayers we've invested in to go through our education system. They would also qualify. And essentially it gives them, like I said, that conditional resident status, which you can have up to 8 years. So you basically have 8 years to then continue to, go to school, work, serve in our military so that you can gain the permanent residency. And then once you have your permanent residency, you can get your citizenship. Now, again, you're going to hear this kind of as a theme throughout today is, criminal convictions. You could lose your conditional permanent residency status. You could lose your permanent residency status. Essentially, only US citizens can commit any crime and not jeopardize their privilege of living in the United States. So again, just be very careful, get those criminal convictions or criminal history evaluated before you move to apply for DACA or the DREAM Act or any other, immigration application. The beauty of both the Dream and Promise Act and the DREAM Act of 2021, if you've got DACA, you're already going to qualify for that conditional residence. So kind of think of that conditional residence as like similar to the requirements of DACA. So if you got DACA, you've already met those requirements, you would automatically get that conditional residency. So here's some of the differences. So DACA, for example, you had to come to the United States before the age of 16. The DREAM Act basically says before the age of 17. I think it's the Dream and Promise Act before the age of 18. So there's little details that like going to include, a larger segment of the population. You had to live continuously in the United States at least 4 years prior to the bill's enactment. So just say, for example, it passes this year, 2021, you would have to show physical presence in the United States since 2017. So the burden is much less. For DACA, for example, you have to show continuous physical presence since 2007, June 15, 2007, 5 years prior to DACA being enacted. So again, a lot less physical presence requirement. You do have to demonstrate good moral character. You're subject to biographic, background checks. You have to have been admitted to a college or university, earned a high school diploma, or you're in the process of earning your high school diploma or an equivalent. So the message is, if you haven't graduated, go back to school. If you're in school, finish school. Continue to get your education. Continue to study. Continue to work hard and go to school. And obviously, there will be a application fee. The Dream and Promise Act essentially encompasses the DREAM Act, right? So again, some differences. The Dream and Promise Act is going to allow for that conditional permanent residency status for 10 years versus the 8 years of the DREAM Act. It's just giving you a couple more extra years to satisfy the additional requirements. And then you have to demonstrate that you've been continuously physically present in the United States on or before January 1st, 2021. So again, a little bit more generous. 18 years old instead of the 17 years old. So, another group of people can possibly apply. And again, you're looking out for those kind of public safety, national security risks, the criminal history, if you've engaged in terrorism. Obviously, if you have any of those factors, it would negatively impact your ability to apply for the conditional permanent residency. And then again, if you have criminal convictions, it's not saying that you can't apply or that it's automatically, a denial. But you want to be very careful, because if you've received a sentence of 1 year or more for any conviction, that's going to, put you out of the running in terms of getting that conditional residency status. If you have 3 or more offenses, which you were convicted of on 3 different dates, and you had a sentence of being in prison for more than 90 days, that's also going to disqualify you for the conditional residence. And then any crime of domestic violence, right? So you want to be very, very careful with those criminal convictions before applying. You would graduate from high school, you'd obtain your GED, or again, you're in the process of obtaining that GED, you're enrolled in school, you pass that background check. And then in addition, certain children of temporary workers who arrived in the United States at the age of 18 or younger would also be eligible to apply. So that's, again, a little bit of a broader benefit than the DREAM Act. In addition, once you have that conditional residence, then you'll be able to continue on to that lawful permanent residency status. And there's essentially 3 tracks to get to that place. You either need to continue going to school, right? So it's the education track that you've gotten a degree from a U.S. institution of higher education. You've got at least 2 years in a bachelor's or high degree program in a career or technical school. You've got the military track, which is at least 2 years of military service. And then you've got the employment track, which is essentially 3 years working in the United States, but with authorization. So if you've got DACA and you've got 3 years, then you would qualify. So they're just not going to count, employment when you didn't have your work permit. In addition, the Dream and Promise Act, again, this is really important because these are just great benefits and opportunities that we want to see for so many of our dreamers and young people and young adults. It would give dreamers access to in-state tuition and federal financial aid. So even though here in California, we have AB 540, we may take that for granted by now, that is not the case for many states. I think there's only 13 states right now in the United States that allow undocumented immigrants or immigrants without legal status to pay in-state tuition. So this would make it national, right? Everybody in the United States, regardless of your immigration status, would be eligible to pay in-state tuition, and they would be able to access that federal financial aid. Also, dreamers who were deported by Trump may be able to apply for relief abroad, and very important, temporary protected status and people that have the deferred, I'm going to mess up the acronym, enforcement departure, would also be eligible for that LPR status, the lawful permanent residency status. Here are some highlights from the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. It's going to change our laws in terms of referring to foreign-born individuals as aliens to non-citizens. I think it's just much more humanitarian. It's not like they're from outer space. So that's a major change in the language, and I think language is important when it talks about, the respect and dignity of every human being. So that is a significant change. And then in addition, anyone who entered the United States before January 1st, 2021 could qualify for work authorization, a travel permit, and similar to like the DREAM Act and the Dream and Promise Act, that conditional permanent resident, this calls it lawful prospective immigrant, right? And you can get that for 6 years. It's similar to the conditional resident, not quite the same thing because it's not legal status technically, but at least gives people a pathway to get that legal status, to get that residency in the end. It increases the number of employment-based immigrant visas available, and it gives lawful permanent residency status to international students who are educated in the United States with PhDs in the STEM field, non-citizens, so it includes the DREAM Act, it includes the the Dream and Promise Act, so very similar, that would also be included in here. Individuals with an approved immigrant petition for 10 years would also be included. Agricultural workers, right, so our farm workers who, help bring the food from the farm to our table would qualify if they worked at least 400 work days in the United States. And then TPS, so people with temporary protected status or that deferred enforced departure would also be included. So again, it's the DREAM Act, it's the Dream and Promise Act, it's kind of all folded in and more. So this is kind of the broadest, most beneficial piece of legislation that, like I said, that we have pending. It would increase the diversity green cards from 55,000 to 80,000. It eliminates a lot of quotas in the employment-based categories. It increases the number of immigrant visas changes for other workers, which are more unskilled workforce that we, desperately need sometimes, especially in our hotel and hospitality industries. And it basically creates a way in which when there is high levels of unemployment in a certain geographical area, that they're not going to be eligible for like bringing immigrants to do that work. There's going to be some protections in place. There's going to be a pilot program that's going to allow to admit about 10,000 workers who we deem their employment is essential to the economy. It would be a 5-year pilot program. It has different changes for H-1B, which may not be our audience right now, but spouses of H-1B holders would be able to get work authorization. There's going to be a reprioritization of those H-1B applications as well. It provides for expediting trade and travel at ports of entry, and employment authorization. You would be surprised to hear how many years sometimes asylum applicants are waiting just to get that, that work authorization. So all of those are kind of our new policies, right? Those are new policy changes, our pending legislation. One thing I want to make very clear, pending legislation does not mean law. So it means that simply that these are ideas, they're proposals. We really, as citizens, and I don't mean as US citizens, as tax-paying individuals, if you go shopping and you're paying taxes, you're buying clothes, groceries, etc., you are essentially a voice. Your congressional representative, is to represent their district, and that is all their taxpayers. So please, please, please use your voice, contact your congressional representatives and let them know that you want to see their support for these bills. But I also want you to be very careful, because anytime there's these broad kind of opportunities just announced, they're not even like in effect, a lot of notaries, consultants, attorneys even will start charging people for processes that they cannot file. So I just want to be very clear that right now there is no new opportunity. We get calls every single day at our office. People want to know, they heard this, they heard that, how can they apply? Give them the details. And I keep telling them, we have to wait. We have to be patient. In the meantime, get your documents together, get your, birth certificate, marriage certificate, kids' birth certificates, physical presence documents, your paycheck stubs, your taxes, your school records, your transcripts, get all of those things together. So don't just sit back and do nothing. There are things that you can do to organize, but you can't move forward. So don't pay anybody for any of these, proposals, for the DREAM Act, for the Dream and Promise Act, for the Citizenship Act, for amnesty. There is no possibility right now for people to be able to legalize their status simply based on the amount of time that they've been here. So we need to keep advocating, we need to keep pushing, and just be very careful. So these are just kind of a few tips about how you can protect yourself from falling prey to immigration fraud, because we know there's a lot out there. Don't sign blank documents that they can fill in with false information. You're ultimately responsible for whatever that application contains when it has your signature. Don't sign a contract that you don't understand. Make sure you get it in writing, get your receipts, given to you. If there's problems, you need that evidence. You need those documents in order to file a complaint against a lawyer, against a business, against a notary, etc. So, and then always make sure you get copies of whatever work product that they're doing for you, right? So you're the client. They're providing a professional service. It's your property, right? You are paying for them to do this. You are entitled to a copy. You're entitled to your file. Don't just assume that they're going to be there forever, and don't just assume they actually did the work that you contracted them to do. So many people have come to our office, 10 years later, waiting for their priority date to become current, not realizing that no one ever filed anything on their behalf. Get a second opinion. If you have any doubts, please, pay that extra, $50, $100, whatever it may be. Get a second opinion if you have any doubts before moving forward, because you may not have money on the line, but you have your future. And to me, your future is far more valuable than any, monetary cost. So do your due diligence, your homework, and make sure you go to a trustworthy and individual. If you've been a victim of fraud, you can call the state bar. They investigate not just attorneys, but they're really taking big efforts to protect our public against anyone who is practicing law, right? So people who are doing things that they shouldn't be doing as lawyers when they're not licensed. You can also call the Attorney General of California and their numbers here. You can try to call the police or the district attorney's office. I will tell you just from my experience, oftentimes they don't have the resources and it's not necessarily a priority, but nonetheless, it is a crime and you should still try and report it. Kind of touched on these points already. Just make sure right now you're getting educated, stay abreast of the changes, be prepared, don't wait, get the documents as if it's coming, get ready, go back to school, get your GED, have a plan, make sure you have everything that you need. And in the meantime, continue to use your voice, call your congressional representative. And lastly, here are just some community resources I generally like to share of organizations here in Orange County, local to Congressman Correa's district, that are accredited by the Department of Justice, but they receive government funding, they receive grants from churches, so they can often help people for a lot less money than an attorney. And I'm always one to support these organizations to the extent that we can, and especially if an individual can't afford an attorney, we want to make sure that they know about these resources as well. So here's our contact information. Again, we are here to support you, your organization, your school, your community, anything we can do to do these education presentations to help get the word out. Feel free to contact us. You want to schedule a consultation, we do charge $50. The link is on there. You can call our office, whatever is easiest for you. But we really look forward to supporting you. This 2021 is your year. So I want everyone to dream big, dream beyond, and pun intended, dream beyond the work permit, dream beyond the permanent residency. I want everyone to help everyone fulfill their dream of becoming a U.S. citizen. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for joining us. And again, I'm Lisa Ramirez. If there's anything we can do to support you, do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you so much. And thank you, Congressman, for your time and your dedication and your service to our community.